Well, I want to thank Mickey for reading the texts today. I realize we have a lot of visitors here today, and you didn't hear biblical texts, so that's pretty normal for us. You might hear a biblical text, but more often than not, you're going to hear poems and things that draw us into the depths of human existence. And the two readings, one from Annie Dillard, the one about riding those monsters down into the deeps of life, and the one of Billy Collins, who speaks of being aware of the potential and impending death in the airplane and wanting to say some words before they take off. Both relate to what I want to talk about today. Last week I spoke of, and today's really part two, in a sense, from last week. So if you missed last week, you can go back to Facebook or our website and see that. But last week I spoke of Lent in terms of diving into the wrecks of our lives as a way of digging into the depths of who we are. And some of you said to me, you're telling me that my life is a wreck. And I'm saying, as a corrective, I did not say your life is a wreck, but that all our lives have wrecks. In other words, all our lives contain things in the depths of who we are, our longings, our pain, our struggles, our unrequited loves, our failures, wrecks of the soul, that if you follow those temptations, as I talked to the children, I was trying to figure out how to tell them about that. And if you follow those temptations down, there are the sources of those temptations that require some interaction, require some examination. And so I encouraged a Lenten practice to start with temptations and to realize they are pointing to something deeper down in the soul. And I used this image of the scuba diver who was in the poem from Adrienne Rich, diving into the wrecks. And she says how she goes down, and as she's going down, she starts to see the shipwreck and realize she is the wreck and the wreck is her. Now, I'm not saying dive holding your breath, okay? Has anybody been scuba diving in here? Yeah, some of you have. Now, I learned scuba diving in a swimming pool. I took it as the final requirement of going to the University of Vermont, my gym requirement, and I learned to scuba dive in a swimming pool. And I thought, man, this is easy. You just put the equipment on and you just dive in and you swim around and you float and you feel real great and everything's kind of like no real problem there. Until the time for the test came. And they took us out on a boat into Lake Champlain in April. Now, I don't know who's been up there in that direction, but Lake Champlain freezes over and people drive trucks onto Lake Champlain in the winter. So we get out there on a boat, small little boat, and we're in our wetsuits, and they're pouring hot, boiling water into the suits to keep us warm. And then the instructor says, okay, everybody over the edge. So we go over the edge, and we go down, and Lake Champlain is not Bermuda. 10 feet down into this lake, I can't see a thing. It's black down there. You can maybe see the person near you. And we get down, 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 and I don't know how far it's going to go. And the terror starts to grab me. And we finally hit the bottom, and I'm fluttering my feet. and making everything worse because as I flutter my feet, the dust and the muck starts boiling up around us and no one can see anything. And the instructor grabs me by the chest and brings me back up, and he says to me, "You have to relax." Terror of being in that dark. Not being able to see, not really even knowing why I was down there. So to do the diving into the wreck that I talked about last week, you have to leave the boat. You have to have the right equipment. You have to have a friend, and sometimes you need an instructor to pull you up and say, "Relax." So a little corrective from last week. I wasn't saying just jump in and everything's going to be okay. But I am saying don't just stay up on deck. To confront, to explore the depths of the soul, as the poet described, diving in like a mermaid or scuba diver, is to reconcile those depths with the spiritual life. So this week, what I'm asking is, why should we dive at all? Which I'm sure it was a question you asked as you left here last week. Why dive into the depths of the soul? It's pretty nice up here on the deck. It's warm. And I'm reminded that each tradition, every religious tradition, has a practice of asceticism or withdrawal or retreat or fasting that is a way of diving to confront the soul. And what they all know is this, that the first part of our lives is figuring out our place, our significance, building up who we are, who we will be, what we will do. That's what everyone in the first part of their life is going through. And in the second part, we start asking, what is this all for? What am I supposed to do with this life that I have composed? Am I to protect it, promote it, defend it? Is there a bigger purpose in my life? Now remember, this is not age-specific. First part ends when you are 39 and second part ends when you are 40. I know some 11-year-olds who know very well that second part. And I know some 45-year-olds like me who are only in that first part. But either way, what happens in these parts of our lives when we get into this, especially that second part, is an awareness of the tragic in life. And that's what I want to talk about today. Miguel Unamuno, a philosopher from Spain from the 20th century, fairly obscure philosopher, started to use the words, the tragic sense of life, in his writing. Miguel is the one who told Western Christians that they had distorted the idea of faith by aligning it with the word progress. What he said was that life is not and never has been a straight line. Life is loss and renewal, chaos and healing, death and rebirth, and often all at once. For Miguel Unamuno, faith was trust. the concept at the center of my understanding of faith. Trust that on the soul's ground floor there is a strong and powerful force that meets death and reason and truths that appear when we find ways to reconcile the contradictions and the chaos in our lives. When we meet the tragic sense of life with a handshake. We all know people who have done that. Maybe you have done that. And I was reading this week, I was thinking about who in the media, who in the world has taken loss and made of it gain, often for others, not for themselves. And I came across the story of Elizabeth Smart. You remember her? The Mormon teenager was kidnapped and then found. And in all of our imaginations, we could compose what would happen to such a person. What kind of life could she have had after that? Well, now she is a college grad, and she is married, and she is working as a correspondent for ABC News, and her news reports are on issues related to children and the Prevent Children. She wrote a book about her perspective. She published the book. She became a public person. And to do all that, she had to enter the second part of life, to reconcile the loss of her childhood, the loss of her innocence. She had to embrace the tragic sense of life and turn it into something that she could gain from and others also could gain from. She had to go diving into the wreck to find a renewed purpose, a sense that there is power in the soul to make changes in one's life, as Annie Dillard pointed out. And I realize even now as I'm saying this, there are not all situations that can be turned in that way. Not all wrecks can or should be explored so deeply, but examples like this point that it is possible. It is possible to transform those moments in our lives. The second half of life requires us to embrace the tragic sense of life. I'm sure many of you have watched Downton Abbey, right? Just ask Lady Mary about the tragic sense of life. The ups, the downs, the loss, the gain, the death, the birth, the betrayal, the forgiveness, the desire, the hope. These are all things that make for good television series. But in that show, they point to them very clearly and say, in a way, stepping back, life is about the tragic sense of what happens. And the best characters in this show are Anna and Bates. They are middle-of-the-road employees. They are conciliatory, they are moral, and they are kind. I think they are the ballast of the institution of that show, because they don't give up when the worst happens and when the best happens. In a poignant moment when Bates finds a kind of freedom, no spoiler alert here, I will not spoil it for you. When Bates finds a kind of freedom, they embrace this moment and they do one thing. They describe their faith and they give thanks in God and in each other. To accept that life is tragic, and I don't mean depressing or doomed. I mean filled with the ups and the downs, the peaks and the valleys, the success and the failure, to pass through those as the poet said today, to recognize the death of us all, but to step onto the plane anyway, to ride those monsters down, as Annie Dillard said, with grace is a position of faith and our kind of faith. I'm saying that the tragic sense of life defined by a Spanish philosopher 100 years ago is part of who we are as spiritual people. It's not unbelief or pessimism or fatalism or cynicism. I'm not saying that all life sucks, although I can say that sometimes. I'm saying that in its ultimate and humanizing realism, we can celebrate that the spiritual life demands this of us, to embrace life, tragedy and all. Now, I've been reading a book I recommend to you called Falling Upward by Richard Rohr. It's not a new book. Richard Rohr is a Catholic, and he speaks of this kind of faith in a very Unitarian way, I must say. And I want to read you a little piece of this. He says, the tragic sense of life is ironically not tragic at all, at least in the big picture. Living in such deep time, connected to past and future, prepares us for necessary suffering, keeps us from despair about our own failure and loss, and ironically offers us a way through it all. We are merely joining the great parade of humanity that has walked ahead of us and will follow after us. He goes on to address this issue of trust and how it is a key to understanding and accepting this tragic sense of life. He says to trust the real and to trust that God is found within it is the price we pay to keep the human heart from closing down and the soul open for something more. I wish someone in the first part of my life had told me this. Told me about the tragic sense of life and how embracing it is a key to finding the power and the goodness within. It would have saved me a whole lot of struggling. Or told me that life is where you stumble and fall, and there you find pure gold, as Carl Jung said. Or first there is a fall, and then there is a recovery from the fall, and both are the mercy of God, as Lady Julian said, not a character in Downton Abbey, but a 14th century mystic. First there is a fall, and then there is a recovery, and both are the mercy of God. It is a great pleasure for me to speak to you and to myself, to speak to strong and successful and educated people and say that embracing this tragic sense of life means that you will and must lose at something. This is the only way that life and mercy and God and mystery can get us to change, to let go, to go on a spiritual journey. I wish I could say this is not true, but it is darn near the absolute truth in spiritual life. There are parables that talk of this in the world's religions, of losing something, of searching for it anew, of finding it, and then celebrating it with a big party afterward. The book of Job is this exactly. And all these religions say that there will always be at least one situation in our lives that we cannot fix, we cannot control, we cannot explain, we cannot change, we cannot sometimes even understand. And in them, the tragic meets the blessings that we can count on. The treasures in the wrecks on the bottom of the sea of our lives. It is a good idea to dive down into those wrecks, to see what the soul has to say, to get to know the depths, to practice and confront them, rather than pretend they don't exist at all and stay up on the deck. This is where practices like I described last week can come in handy. In Lent, let us notice the tragic in life with the goal of embracing it and knowing it and holding it close to the bones of our lives. To dive or ride those monsters down, that is part of the spiritual life. And that is in part why we are here. That is in part why you have asked me to speak today, to remind you of this reality. That is the spiritual task. And that is the good news. That is our good news today. Amen. Amen.